Hello, everyone, and hello to everyone online. I should remember to look at the camera. I'm not going to introduce myself yet or the speakers, because first we're going to hear from the hosts and organisers who have worked tremendously hard throughout quite a long period to put this event together. So Legal Voices for the Future, we're going to get an introduction to who they are from Harriet Hall, and then we're going to hear a bit about UKELA Southwest and what they've been up to shortly after that. So Harriet, over to you very quickly.
Hi everyone, joining in the room and also online. I think the camera's up there somewhere.
Can you head over next to Nia?
Into that. Sorry, I'll come through. Thank you. Hello everyone.
You can see that.
I didn't see I wasn't on the camera. Well, thank you for joining us today. I am Harriet. I'm the co-chair of Legal Voices for the Future. And thank you for joining this knowledge session today, which we're really excited to be partnering with UKELA Southwest on, and kindly hosted by Burges Salmon as well, and joined by some fantastic panelists. So thank you very much everyone for being here and for all the work that's gone in. I just wanted to very briefly give you a quick intro about what LVF do in case you've not come across us before. We are an organisation run by and for junior legal practitioners. We aim to bring juniors from all across the legal sector in all areas of legal practice together to learn about how the climate and ecological crises intersect with the law. The main way we do this is by hosting free monthly knowledge sessions and educational events, just like this one, which tend to be led by our members. And recordings of all of our previous sessions are available online, so do check them out on our website. We've got a nice banner out by the drinks that you can scan QR codes from to follow us on socials. And if you would like to learn a bit more about us, or perhaps even propose your own session idea, do scan one of those QR codes, and we support our members to deliver events on a huge range of topics. So do reach out. But for now, I'll pass over to Antonia, who's going to give an intro to UKELA Southwest.
Only space for one person down here. Yeah. Hi everyone online. Thank you so much for coming. I recognise a few faces already, so I know that a few of you are already UKELA members. For those of you who aren't, we actually have some of UKELA Central here as well, who will be able to kind of talk to you afterwards a bit about the networking. But we are UK Environmental Law Association, and the Southwest contingent specifically, we have events all around. We try and do all around the Southwest, predominantly Bristol, where we will try and kind of focus on things that are particularly pertinent to the Southwest with environmental law. Things coming up at the moment, we've got a satellite viewing of the Ghana lecture. That's the big lecture that it's next Tuesday that UKELA are having in London, and we're having a viewing in Bristol at Albion Chambers. And then other than that, coming up in the next few months, we've got some other sessions that we will run on either educational environmental topics or kind of social aspects as well. So if you are interested, it's open to environmental lawyers and environmental professionals. Please feel free to chat to me afterwards, or Pippa, who's just at the back, is from UKELA Central, and she'll be here. And I think there's a QR code at the front for those
there is a QR code on the
joining as well for free,
where the badges were.
Yes, I'll pass back over to Nina.
I love the UKELA Central terminology. I guess that's part of me too. Okay, well, I'm the least important person here, so I'll quickly run through who I am. I'm Nina Pindham, chair of UKELA Central, and barrister in private practice at Cornerstone Barristers. Now, I'm going to introduce our outstanding panel today to whet your appetites. It's a very, very exciting seminar. In the order in which we're going to hear them, we've got Marcus Reynolds. I promised not to talk about his archery prowess, and I've just done it. Sorry, Marcus. He is a senior managing consultant at Ramble. He has over 20 years of experience with EHS compliance assurance, including environmental permitting, and you'll see his expertise shortly. Auditing within a range of industrial sectors, including data centers, so the very cutting edge, as well as upstream and downstream oil and gas, general manufacturing, and other very exciting environmental permitting topics. He has particular specialties in environmental permitting, as well as environmental management systems and fire risk assessment. So Very, very exciting. I'll see how you can gather that all together under the permitting umbrella. It's pretty easy. I think it covers everything, as we'll see. Next, we've got Jo Pope. She's the Environmental and Permit Assurance Manager within Pindham. She brings over 20 years of experience in environmental permitting also to our panel. She has lots of experience in regulatory compliance, as anyone working in the water sector does. And that's across very complex operational landscapes. Her career is grounded in environmental governance and reporting, and she has a strong focus integrating environmental management systems to drive improvement and align alongside evolving UK legislation. And we're going to hear a bit about the very quickly moving and complicatedly evolving, if I can put it that way, landscape that Jo is navigating. And last but not least, we have Lord Banner, King's Counsel. He is a barrister at Keating Chambers, a working peer in the House of Lords, doesn't seem to sleep. And specialisms, for those who don't know, everyone knows, but I'll cover it all. Specialisms are planning and environmental law. He was voted, I don't know where to stop with this, Charlie.
Stop now.
I'm not going to. I'm going to embarrass you thoroughly. Number 1, planning King's Counsel in Great Britain in Planning Magazine's legal survey, ranked as a leading silk in 8 practice areas in Chambers and Partners. And those of you who know Chambers and Partners don't really understand how that's possible, but it is. As well as ranked in, obviously, the Legal 500 UK bar. He was just picked to the post, I think, by Estelle Dehaun and Barrister of the Year, and that was the year Estelle succeeded in Finch. So don't feel too bad, Charlie. That was an obvious outcome. And was also Times Lawyer of the Week March last year. From 2017 until 2024, he was board member of the JNCC, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, latterly serving as chair of that committee, and former trustee of UKELA, so former part of UKELA Central. All right, I stopped embarrassing you, Charlie. We're going to move on to the presentations, and I promised housekeeping, which is somebody seems to have already done it online. If you are online, Louise has served you very well. She's told you put everything in the chat. So please do, we'll keep an eye on that as sessions progress, and we will have a break for Q&A about 3/4 of the way through prior to the, after we hear from the speakers and prior to the creative content session, which is a feature of Legal Voices for the Future events. And with no further ado, I'm going to pass over to Marcus. There we are. And it's obvious, click to the right to go ahead.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This will be very whistle stop. I'm afraid that there's too much detail in the environmental permitting regime to go into a lot of detail here, but I will talk about what the current permitting regime looks like, focusing mainly on the industrial side of things, because Jo will be talking about the water parts after that. A large part of our current permitting regime comes from the Industrial Emissions Directive, which replaced 7 earlier directives. Before that, it was a very hodgepodge collection of permitting regimes that were around. And of course, there are regional variations in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and England and Wales are together. There are many different types of permits. You have, at the very top, you have the Part A or Part A1 permits, which are the Environment Agency or SEPA, and then further down, local authority permits, and then exemptions from permits. Some exemptions you have to register, some you don't have to register. And then at the bottom are the regulatory position statements, where the regulator said, okay, well, we don't want to fully regulate this at the moment, so we'll keep an eye on it. And it's actually for you to keep an eye on it too, because if you're relying on one of those, it can be withdrawn, leaving you in the lurch. So what does need an environmental permit? Many of you are probably aware of a lot of this, but there's the list. So installations permits. So realistically, the larger industrial type processes. And I say larger, I've permitted a Part A1 permit, which was 1 fume cabinet on a site, doing something very small, but it still needed a Part A1 permit, much to the dismay of the operator. Waste operations. There are a lot of waste operations around the country, anything from storage to processing, the waste transfer sites on top of that. Mining waste. Thankfully, there's not quite so many of those. Even fewer small waste incineration plants. And then there's mobile plants. It's not fixed in one place. It's taken to other sites where it's undertaking activities there. And then solvent emissions activities, where people are using solvents or volatile organic compounds and emitting them to air. Then you get into the water regime for discharges to surface water and groundwater. I'm not really going to talk about those. That is Joe's field of expertise there. And then more recently, in a few within the last 10 years, we've had floodplain works incorporated into the permitting regime as well. So people working within certain distances of main rivers will have to have a permit before they can conduct work there. And then radioactive substances, which I'm not going to talk about at all because it's a very specialist area. I'm not going to have this up for too long, but there are a lot of schedules at the end of the environmental permitting regulations if we're just looking at England and Wales, and they cover a vast amount of activities. And I've highlighted the first one there, which is really Schedule 1 activities, and this next slide will break that down even further to the types of industrial processes which will need a permit. And within all of those, there will be different activities, some with thresholds, some without thresholds. And it's an industry in itself to keep people working at 49.9 tonnes, if the threshold is 50 tonnes, just to keep people out of permitting if they can. So that's what we have in terms of a regime or activities that are being permitted at the moment. So what's happening? What's changing to the permitting regime? Well, since we left the EU, we don't have the European BAT regime anymore. So these are the best available techniques. So for every permitted sector, there will be something called BAT for that sector. If you are doing this activity, these are the techniques that you should be using. These are the technologies and how you should use those technologies to achieve a decent standard of protection for the environment. When we left the EU, anything that's been published after that is not relevant to us in the UK at all. It's good for information, but it's not legally binding. So UK government said, okay, well, there's a bit of a gap there because some have been published since we've left. And so we're playing catch up. 9 are currently under development. There's 2 ferrous metal ones and 1 common waste gas management one for the chemical sector that have been published in draft. They should be being published in final by the end of this year, and then a statutory instrument in early 2026 to give those legal effect in the UK. One of the main ones here is the waste gas treatment in the chemical sector. And you can see in that blue box there that this will be the main or primary BAT conclusions for approximately 300 of the 460 chemical installations in the UK. Haven't had a decent overarching BAT document before. And this will introduce a lot of new emission limits that they haven't had before. So just like in the EU, when this is published, there will be 4 years for implementation. So within 4 years of that being of the statutory instrument, all permits for that sector must be updated. And you can see the numbers there. We're looking at 300 of 418 just in England, and that will be their primary thing. If the sector organisations have been active in the European BAT, then they would have had a say in what was being set up there. If they weren't, the UK government hasn't had a say in that either. And I don't want to simplify things too much, but what appears to have happened is the UK BAT group have taken the EU BAT conclusions, done a find and replace for EU and changed it to UK, moved the order of some of them around for some unknown reason and then republished it. So we'll see what happens with the other breaths, the other back conclusions as they work through them. But it's good news in that we are not diverging too far from EU BAT, and I think there would be legal troubles with trying to do that with having an unlevel playing field anyway. So data centers and permitting, everybody sees data centers in the news very frequently, no doubt. The boom in AI, everyone is using it, whether you know about it or not. And permitting. Now, data centers do not need a permit. The operating of the data halls and the cooling systems. There is nothing that they do that requires a permit. You're permitting the generators, not the data center. And in fact, when you get a permit for data centers, you can carve out just the plot with the generators on and the fuel systems and the drainage systems, etc., and leave the data halls and cooling systems and everything completely separate from that. If you, before the medium combustion plant directive came in, a data center under 50 megawatts wouldn't have needed a permit at all. Now the medium combustion plant directive has come in, and we have that through our permitting regs. All data centers need a permit if they have any generators over 1 megawatt, and they will, because that's tiny, between 1 and 50. Water consumption in a data center permit is not currently regulated because it is used to cool the data center equipment. It's nothing to do with the generators. So there is no permit covering water consumption unless you have an abstraction from surface water or groundwater for your data center, and then it will be in a permit. If you're taking water from the mains water, as some of them are, here's an example of a site in Slough. It's under 50 megawatts. It has a medium combustion plant permit, and in peak times, it will use 250,000 litres a day, 250,000 litres per day of cooling water, taken from the mains, pumped through a cooling circuit once, and then out into foul sewer after that. So that's the equivalent of 1,300 people's daily consumption. And then the wastewater treatment plant has to take that, and that's taking some of the capacity away from the wastewater treatment plant, even though it's tap water, really. So it seems strange, but you're not allowed to discharge it to soakaway or anything along those lines because it's classed as trade effluent. And some data centers now are becoming so large, they're storing diesel. I was looking at one today. It will have 10,000 tons of diesel when it is fully built, and that will last the generators 48 hours if they have to run. And so anything over 2,500 tons is a coma site in the same way as, chemical works, Buncefield, etc., is just purely on diesel. So data centers are a strange beast when it comes to permitting, because you'd think that the permits should be covering a lot more sectors than they really are and activities, and it's just the generators. And electricity use, as everybody knows, is increasing so rapidly, but they're using hundreds and hundreds of megawatts. You can't have battery energy storage systems that will run for that period of time. Have wind power. It's just not there. So generators are where we're going to sit for some time. And in fact, generators are considered BAT, diesel generators. In the medium term, hopefully you're all aware of this consultation that has just finished recently, DEFRA, on changes and modernising environmental permitting for industry. It's very interesting. Those are the chapters on what it was covering. It was very broad. It was asking questions such as, what do you think we should include when developing policy around this sector? Right, okay, you want us to do your job for you, we can do that. And jumping into some of the topics that were in there are all of these areas. And I think it's an interesting time. They're looking at things that are really holding things up for industry. Research and development exemptions, commercial confidentiality, certain things and emission detail on emissions has to go on the public register, and people can work out, well, what your process is doing then, if they're looking at that. R&D exemptions, if you are coming up with a new way of generating hydrogen, you can't use that hydrogen after it's come off. You have to burn it, which seems slightly odd, but it's stopping people from making use of these exemptions to do economic activity. Guidance on emerging techniques. I've spoken about how long it takes to get BAT going. Some BAT are coming around for another review. It was originally set 20 years ago. Sectors move on very quickly, and hydrogen was one of the first ones. New techniques for making hydrogen, there wasn't BAT in place. So you have to work on a very precautionary principle. Fully integrated pollution control is talking about making all of the smaller Part B activities follow more stringent requirements for looking at how you are storing things. Soil pollution, ground pollution, where they've only ever looked at air before. So it's going to be a bit of a shock for some people. Battery energy storage systems, they don't need a permit at the moment, but it looks as though they will be brought into the permitting regime. There will be another consultation on it. We were supposed to have it last year. It didn't happen. It looks as though they may be standard rules permits for battery energy storage systems, with the main issue really being, what do you do when they catch on fire? Because they make a lot of contaminating firewater. I'd say 90-something% of the battery energy storage systems built so far are on a nice permeable gravel pad with no way to capture any firewater. So if you bring them into the permitting regime, how long a period do you have for people to retrofit anything? Is it going to be cost effective to do that? Is it going to be cost effective to just stop the site, build another one somewhere else? We'll see. Battery manufacturing with the EV revolution is going to be much more important. That's been brought in the European permitting regime, but of course it's not covering us anymore. And then non-waste anaerobic digestion, plants that are literally growing crops to then put them in anaerobic digestion plants, which seems perverse really in a way. There's plenty of waste streams that could be dealt with, but they're not well. There's no decent framework for regulating that whole aspect. And then the one hidden near the bottom, emission limit value guidance change. Historically, if there was an emission limit range of, say, 50 to 100 milligrams per cubic meter, people would get 100 in their permits and they would work for that. Now the presumption will be in Europe and possibly here that you must work to the most stringent and tight target that you can achieve reasonably, which is going to be quite a struggle for some older plants. And don't forget the medium combustion plant that we had from 2018. One of the reasons why the Environment Agency has had to throw so many resources at permitting a lot of plants, thousands and thousands of permits went in for that. It's going to happen again in 2028, pretty much. 15,000 sites will need permits then. But these are the very small end. So can we not just do something more sensible, like a registration approach, a standard rules, something along those lines? Some of these sites that this will apply to will be schools, offices. They've never had to have any involvement with the environmental permitting regime before. Can they afford to do that? What will the price be? We don't know. There are some prices for standard rules on other combustion things. And then when you get into larger backup generators, some backup generators are having to spend £6,500 just on the permit for something that they might use 2 hours a year. It's a burden on industry. Longer term, I'm going to gloss straight through this because the EU Industrial Emissions Directive, there was an update in 2024, doesn't apply to us. Should it? There's a lot of good stuff coming in it. Deep industrial transformation, forcing permit holders to publish plans. How are you going to decarbonise? And it has to be published publicly. They're adding some new activities there and saying, right, well, BAT shouldn't take 20 years between updates. Let's try and do it between 10 to 12 years maximum, 8 ideally. We'll see how that goes. They've added things whereby operators who must have an environmental management system actually now have to have it certified. So that's a gift to certification bodies. And it's Burges' belief that they have to do that, given that we know people who have certified management systems, they can be very consistent and meet the standard, but not actually achieve any decent control of emissions. They've added a few industrial activities, but the only one I'm going to talk about on there is the fact that making hydrogen from electrolysis of water in the UK requires a Part A1 permit of anything over the lab scale. And in the EU now, you can make up to 50 tonnes a day without needing a permit. So there will be a lot more of those cropping up in Europe, but not here. And for some reason, they're changing the period of sampling soil and groundwater. They're taking 1 year off it. And I don't really understand why. 10 was a nice round number, and 4 and 9 was
More scientific.
yes. And so what will happen? Will we move towards European standards? We can't move any further away, I think, because then there will be legal challenges of why we're doing that. Decarbonisation and circular economy featuring highly in European directives now. We need to get on that properly. Intensive farming is an aside there, but it's going to push out a lot of smaller operators as the numbers that you can have on a farm before you need a permit go down. And will the UK rejoin the EU? Who knows? I think by the time DEFRA have the results of their consultation published, we might have a new government anyway.
Good luck following that.
Yes. There we go. I think we're actually having questions later.
We are. I am overruling that slide. So we're going to go straight on to the show. And it should, there we go, perfect.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this evening. As you can see, I want to talk tonight really about complexity, compliance and digital transformation within the water industry and the EPR regime. But I wanted to start with a question. What if every or nearly every discharge permit condition was enforced in real time? What would that mean for the EPR regime, and what would that mean for the water industry? It's not necessarily a hypothetical question, it's the direction we're heading. How quickly we can get there is an issue of vision, cost, resource, and technology. For decades, permits have been static documents. They still are. Pages and pages of conditions filed away and checked occasionally, by my team quite often. But to set some scale for you, South West Water have around 2,000 discharge permits, a few waste permits, not many. But yeah, 2,000 bespoke discharge permits with anywhere between 20 and 100 conditions within each of those permits. The EA have reported that they deal with 10,000 applications a year through EPR. And given what Marcus has just said, that's probably light, actually. The world is changing, climate pressures, public scrutiny, and technology are rewriting the rules. This evening, I want to take you through really short-term survival, I think, over the next sort of 12 months, medium-term transformation, and then longer-term reinvention of EPR through the lens of the water industry. So the short-term challenge really is about adaptation under pressure. Huge change at the moment in terms of compliance transition. Permits have been issued for water discharge activities since 1951 in some form. The way they look has changed, the regulations have changed, and the requirements have changed, but they're still effectively a set of static conditions that protect the environment. What is changing at a really rapid rate currently is how compliance is assessed, how it's enforced, and is reported to the public against these permits. So we've seen a massive ramping up of inspections by the Environment Agency over the last few years. In 2021, South West Water had 75 inspections by the Environment Agency. This year to date, we've already had over 500. So it just goes to show that transition. We're expecting that to grow next year as well. This has rightly placed an increased focus on compliance across all conditions, not just numeric limits where we'll be sampling against those, and now increasingly with flow monitoring as well. But it's a resource-hungry process. It eats up a lot of time on both the regulator and the regulated, accompanying visits, issuing car forms and responding to them. This year, we've also seen for the first time the agency making those car forms, compliance assessment reports, publicly available. So it adds to the pressure. Another thing that's changed is the WIRI guidance. So this used to be called 1602. It's the Environment Agency guidance on how the water industry has to report pollution incidents and how they are then assessed. And it has huge implications going forward because it's really shifted the types of things that we now have to report to the agency and how we'll be viewed publicly on those. So you can expect to see over the next period that we've just started, AMP8, that we will see a huge increase in the number of pollutions reported by the Environment Agency against the industry. Not necessarily a worsening of our performance, but just a change in the way things are reported. So you can expect that's going to go down really well with the public. The other thing that's changed as well recently is the Environmental Performance Assessment, which is the Environment Agency's assessment of the water industry against a set number of metrics. This was consulted on and has now come into force for AMP8, start in January. And so the number of metrics is increasing and the thresholds within those metrics as well is tightening. And for the first time, we will be judged on not just the numeric limits, so BOD, phosphorus, ammonia. We're going to be judged also on our compliance across that whole set of permit conditions. And that comes back around to the increasing car inspections that the agency are doing. Finally then in this section really is around the consultation under the Wet Water Special Measures Act on enforcement. So this is looking to introduce variable monetary penalties, perhaps 300,000, perhaps 500,000 per offence under environmental permitting regulations, but also automatic penalties, which will be set out in secondary legislation rather than permit conditions themselves. And this could be for things like not reporting a pollution within 4 hours or an emergency overflow operating more than 3 times a year. So again, a further shift in the sort of punitive action that's being taken on the water industry. And also a change to the civil standard of proof for those penalties as well, which is going to change the landscape significantly. Moving on to the technology side, we've also got to deliver Section 82 of the Environment Act. And this is going to be challenging. We're ramping up to deliver that now. This is about water quality monitoring. So putting in those upstream and downstream monitors within watercourses, upstream and downstream of our overflows and our discharge points, and being able to provide that data in near real time. So for the industry as a whole, that's 14,000 storm overflows and 9,000 sewage treatment works in England. For South West Water, we've got to deliver 90 by March and 400 over the next 5 years, with more to come to 2035. This is hugely challenging. Access to watercourses, planning permission to deploy the technology. So Marcus was saying permits for access to the floodplain, selecting the right mixing zones, the right locations for these monitors, the quality of the measurement itself, vandalism, power, ongoing maintenance are all huge challenges for the industry currently. And then getting all that data and putting it out into the public domain. So the question then really is around, what does that mean for EPR in the future? How is all that information and data about the health of our watercourses going to impact on how the industry is regulated going forward? And lastly, I just wanted to touch on the permitting backlog. So we've talked about how many permits there are and what a huge task it is. In some cases, it's taking 18 months, even 2 years to get a permit issued. The agency are working on this. They know there's more to do, but there has been improvements. But current processes really are administrative, and they're slow. The agency have announced their accelerated permitting transformation program, the APT program, earlier in the year, and it sounds promising, but resource gaps exist. For South West Water alone, we have about 800 permits that have got to be varied in the next 5 years, and we're still waiting on nearly 300 from the previous 5-year period. So that leaves us in a difficult position sometimes around compliance. So that's the short term. Moving on to the medium term then, what can we expect in the next 5 years? The landscape will shift. There's a lot of regulatory restructuring. So you've probably all heard about the Cunliffe review. This is the Independent Water Commission chaired by Sir John Cunliffe, has made 88 recommendations about transforming the water sector into a more efficient, resilient and sustainable system. And we're expecting there's supposed to be a government white paper on this very soon. I think it was expected in October, but hasn't happened yet. So recommendations include things like a single water regulator, merging Ofwat and the Environment Agency, Natural England. What does that look like? How does that work? It's also recommended a shift to open monitoring. So the idea that the water industry marks its own homework with operator self-monitoring. So we take our own samples and report those to the Environment Agency under really stringent conditions. But the Cunliffe is making that recommendation to move to a more open system and a more transparent system. So does that mean putting monitors in automated, taking 15-minute or hourly analysis of that flow? Will that need to be backed up with auto samplers? Will we still need some manual sampling with laboratory analysis for some determinants? Probably yes, but then you've got that mix, and how does that get permitted? So these are all things that are coming, but we don't quite know what they look like yet. On top of that, then you've got, again, the equipment, the installation, and the certification of all of that equipment to the agency's MCERT standards. We're seeing a huge ramp up in flow monitoring has been to MCERT standard for a while. This AMP will see all of the event duration monitors, or a lot of them move to MCERT standard as well. So it's just another layer of complexity, but it also gives trust to the information and data that's coming off those monitors. Cunliffe's also proposed that regulators be empowered to make risk-based decisions. And I think this is really positive. We've seen recently some difficulties in getting things like nature-based solutions over the line for storm overflow treatment and the storm overflow reduction programme, purely because it goes against what the urban wastewater treatment regulations say. So it's kind of trying to cut through that, I think, to make some better decisions for the environment as a whole. And if we can actually improve natural habitats at the same time as reducing storm overflows, then we should be, it's a trust issue on both sides. It's easy to pour concrete and have a guaranteed output. It gives the regulator confidence. It gives us confidence as well that it's been harmonising and we're getting the right output. But for the environment, it might not be the right decision. So that's positive. And I was also going to talk about the DEFRA consultation, but Marcus has covered that. So not huge implications for the water industry, but we do have exempt activities. And so nice to see that there might be some flexibility in that. So then really digital transformation. Will we see a digital permitting platform in the next 5 years? Wouldn't that be good? Automated applications, GIS integration, real-time compliance dashboards. Is it a pipe dream, or can these things be achieved? Hopefully they can. And really need to evolve from static permit conditions to sort of dynamic data-driven frameworks. That would be good. And all of this is set within AMP8. Huge programme of investment, 22 billion across the industry for phosphorus reduction, storm overflow upgrades and continuous river water quality monitoring. And on top of that sits the enforcement risk, higher penalties, more scrutiny, more open data, and more in the public domain. So, a greater risk of private prosecutions. Compliance won't just be legal, it will be public. And that's going to be a journey in itself. So then moving on to the long-term challenges, this is really looking out there to the future. What can we expect in the next sort of 10 to 20 years, really? Continuous monitoring, every discharge, every watercourse, marry those two things up. Real-time quality sensors with river water quality monitoring upstream and downstream. Can this be achieved? We could have EPR permits linked to river health, operate nutrient balancing across the catchment, be flow banded, have seasonal limits. We have some, but could this go further? And could we be really managing cumulative environmental effects rather than just point source individual bespoke conditions on permits? Will we have flexible thresholds and adaptive conditions dependent on environmental risk, catchment demands, and performance history? By 2045, we could be installing advanced treatment, so quaternary treatment for things like micropollutants, so PFAS, etc. Could this be funded by extended producer responsibility, so really pushing the polluter pays principle? And for the keen-eyed, that's another EPR acronym. So EPR now means two things. So I hope you've got your glossary. So yeah, charging back to pharma companies for what's coming down the system. Will we catch up with Europe on the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive as well? That's just been recast in Europe. Goes to some of the points that Marcus was making. Will we see that come in for the UK at some point in the future? And really, looking really into the future, could we have AI-driven compliance? Imagine the entire sewage network and treatment works operating via a digital twin with AI and permits predicting risk, detecting trends, and keeping catchments compliant. So by 2045, would we like to see permits that don't just regulate, they actually predict and prevent pollution before it happens? Imagine that. So yeah, really in summary, environmental permitting is moving. It is moving from paper to platform, from static to hopefully adaptive, and even in the future predictive. The world we're operating in is becoming increasingly complex though, so this is a really, really hard thing to achieve. Water companies must prepare for higher monitoring, intensity, real-time data, and more data-driven enforcement. And regulators are probably going to need to think EPR for water discharges, certainly, how to make the permits and the regime fit for a digital, transparent future. So my question to end my presentation really is, can EPR transform from a compliance tool into an enabler of environmental outcomes? Thank you.
And thank you to the minutes. Thank you very much. I'm just going to ruin our timetable now by keeping talking about very thought-provoking. The idea of a fluctuating set of conditions on a permit informed by real-time continuous monitoring with an instant enforcement mechanism in the background. Absolutely fascinating. Right, but that's not, we have one final amazing speaker for us.
No,
Charlie doesn't roll with slides. So we're going to go to something useful to look at. There we are.
Thank you.
Perfect.
That's about the most I've done by way of slides in about 5 minutes. Good evening. So I've been asked to provide a few reflections on Marcus and Joe's presentations, and also say a little bit about how the consultation that DEFRA have recently undertaken, how that might play out in terms of legislation and parliamentary procedures and timescales. And reflecting on the slides and listening to the presentations, I think there are a number of themes that are worth considering. The first is proportionality. So DEFRA have made a lot in their statements, both before and after the recent consultation, upon a drive towards greater proportionality in the permitting regime, which is something that the Corrie Review called for, and also in the context of nuclear, the Nuclear Regulatory Task Force called for. And certainly if the statements they've made are to be carried forward into legislation, it would seem on the face of it that certain activities which currently are within scope of EPR may be subject to exemptions in order to so the statements say get spades in the ground, etc. But there are mixed messages. Marcus has already outlined how in some respects things may be brought within permitting regime which currently aren't. And the devil will be in the detail when the legislation draft legislation is published. But I don't detect any hint of a pervading proportionality principle. This is something that I suggested in the context of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, I called for was amendment for Parliament for a pervading proportionality principle. So not simply saying, in order to be proportionate, we're going to do this, that, or the other, but rather like Section 3 of the Human Rights Act or the precautionary principle, which are sort of golden threads in the law that influence how law is interpreted and how decisions are made. A proportionality principle would provide that same impetus towards proportionality in terms of how much information is required, how long should something be considered, how do you interpret rules, etc. There's nothing yet in that respect, but it'll be interesting to see how that. I know the Nuclear Regulatory Task Force they issued an interim report in August. They're looking at proportionality in some detail, specifically in the context of nuclear, but their observations in their interim report were very much about environmental regulation generally, and it's at a piece with Corrie, at a piece with what other people have said. And so it'd be interesting to see what comes out of that. A proportionality principle or something similar would be quite a clever way of perhaps mitigating against some of what are perceived in some quarters as the disproportionate demands of countervailing principles, such as in the context of environmental law, the precautionary principle, which some think, I don't offer a view today, goes a little too far in terms of cumulative effects of de minimis, potentially de minimis risks, which may not be necessarily scientifically evidenced, but where they can't be sufficiently disproved. And a key factor, certainly in the real world in Westminster, a key factor in terms of how one deals with all of this is the no regression principle in the Environment Act 2021. So Section 20 of the Environment Act 2021 provides that where environmental legislation is put forward by a government ministry or parliament, they have to certify whether it rose back on the status quo as of the date of the Environment Act 2021. It's not an absolute requirement. We have to confess, a bit like in relation to the Human Rights Act, Section 19. And there was a assiduous attempt, well, not just attempt, they did certify the Planning and Infrastructure Bill as being not non-regressive, which some people think was a fairly bold step, given Part 3, and that's the subject of at least preliminary litigation by Wild Justice. But certainly, if the precautionary principle were to be tampered with, or other EU-derived environmental constraints, and interestingly, even that would apply to the IED as of Brexit, as opposed to the new IED, because of course that's post Environment Act 2021. If surgery were to done to the standard environmental regulation that was in existence as of 2021, there may be concerns about whether that could properly be certified. Is it politically palatable in the current circumstances to certify proposed legislation as progressive? So I would expect that rather than tamper with environmental regulations on one side of the scale, introducing new principles on the other side of the scale, sort of counterbalances, like a proportionality principle, would be quite a clever way of dealing with it. I still think the permitting regime has a degree of overlap with other regulatory regimes. For example, planning, they're not meant to overlap, but in practice they do. That's not helpful, frankly. And I think that would be interesting to see to what extent that could be dealt with in the context of a new regime. There are also conflicts with other regimes. I mean, I've been heavily involved in the last few months in about environmental permitting of an energy facility in Northern Ireland, where they have limited hours of operations because it's fortunately a gas power turbine, which uses a peaking plant, but because of difficulties in the Northern Ireland energy grid, in order to stop the lights going out, they've been told by the energy regulator, you've got to operate all around the clock, but they've only got certain hours permitted in their permit. So on the one hand, they're being told by the regulator, you've got to do this on pain of criminal sanction. On the other hand, if they do it, they'll be subject to another criminal sanction. So how do you reconcile all of that? It's been an absolute muddle. Good for me, not so good for my clients. Again, those are the kinds of overlaps and ambiguities that one would think a new regime ought to cut through in the name of proportionality. I think also it would be regrettable if there was a sort of retrospective moving of the goalposts. Again, you mentioned, Marcus, about battery storage schemes, and to what extent might future changes in the permitting landscape mean they have to retrofit adaptations. I mean, one thing that's pervades both the environmental space, also kind of development, planning and development spaces. When the goalposts are moved, that is really bad for investment, and that's including investment in important things. I mean, battery storage is, broadly speaking, green energy that still needs to be regulated because of fire risks, etc., etc. But if you over-regulate and undermine predictability of certainty, that undermines the appetite of the global financial markets to actually invest in it in the first place. So I think that's quite an important point. Turning then to innovation, the consultation and the surrounding documents talk about unlocking innovative techniques such as carbon capture, hydrogen generation, etc., and making sure they're not unduly regulated by the permitting regime, which is good. Equally, they talk about winding back regulation in relation to risk-free development. And of course, innovative kinds of products and innovative techniques carry with them a degree of additional risk by definition, because they're things that haven't happened before. There's a degree of tension there that's going to have to be worked through. In relation to data centres, something I've been quite heavily involved in the last year, clearly the water issues, which is actually not something I've had so much involvement in, so really interesting to hear about that side. There's the energy demand. Data centres demand huge amounts of energy. One of the big problems with actually delivering, it's all very well having a planning permission, a permit for them, but actually delivering them is many of them can't be powered right now. There simply isn't the bandwidth in the grid, which I'm probably mixing my metaphors, but whatever there is, it's not bandwidth, capacity, headroom in the grid to power data centres. So a lot of the proposals coming forward having their own energy generation is not just the diesel backing. Some of them are coming with very substantial DCO qualifying gas generation, which obviously then presents a tension between government policy on AI and data, but also government policy in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So then what's being looked at in some of these schemes is a sort of tapering. So you are authorised to have the gas generation for X years or until such time as you can connect to the grid, so you're self-fueling. So that's then interesting in terms of permitting, and in terms of planned DCO is how do you then carry that through in terms of a sort of sunset clause, and then how do you do that in a way that doesn't undermine investor confidence, and what if the grid can't deliver in time? So all of that's quite interesting at the moment. My own view is I think that the mid to long term, depending how you define the difference between the two, solution to the energy problem for data centres is likely to be modular nuclear, which is something to be in the news only a few days ago with the Wilfer announcement in North West Wales, if you see. And of course, that then begs a further question: how do you regulate modular nuclear? Because is it? I've done a bit of research on this over the last couple of days. I've not really been able to find very much, if anything, on that. Because you've got obviously nuclear regulation proper for the Hinkley type developments, projects, but that's not really apt to regulate for what may in 10 or 15 years' time be a modular nuclear on site for a particular data centre project to power that project off grid, which isn't even like the Wilfer scheme, which is obviously lots of modular nuclear on one particular site, very localised. So how do you regulate that? Do you bring that within the permit regime? Is that dealt with differently? That's something that's clearly going to require consideration. So I think that is likely to be the green answer to dealing with data centres. The other big thing with data centres is future-proofing and versatility, because I suspect that by the time some of the data centre projects that are going through the system right now, both in planning and permitting, by the time they are fully built out, the tech will be very different. I mean, we are in, to my mind, the analogy is the brick telephones. I'm old enough to remember those. Some of you probably aren't. We were born when they were there, but they're the big brick telephones. They're this big, and of course, then they shrunk. So how do you regulate a data center project in such a way that they are able to adapt quickly with agility during their lifetime, as opposed to waiting 1-2 years, whatever, for the regulatory process to catch up to enable them to do that by which time it's too late? So that's, I think, going to be a key issue. Segue from data center into AI, and again, very interesting going to hear your sort of thoughts on the kind of future of digitalisation. It seems to me there are two dimensions really for how AI can help in the permitting space. One is helping the agency in terms of its processes, both in terms of granting and considering permits and monitoring enforcement, a more sort of dynamic approach as you described, but also in terms of applicants. I mean, there's an interesting statistic was published by DEFRA earlier 25% of permit applications currently provide insufficient information to be permitted. Now, I'm aware of the fact, he says, as an investor in it, that there is a AI product at the moment that does a sort of AI pre-app for building safety regulation applications, which also suffer from issues about adequacy of information. They're very hard to predict. So queries are a scope for that kind of approach for sense checking prospective permit applications to make sure they don't fail. It's 25% failing is a big number, and that's results implications too. Then finally, the parliamentary timetable. Well, the latest DEFRA announced I could find has a wonderful civil service phrase in terms of the future timetable for the legislation, the private legislation that will be needed to give effect to the results, the fruits of the recent consultations, as soon as parliamentary time allows. And you just imagine Sir Humphrey, if you ever watched Yes, Prime Minister, saying that. There was a consultation, a post-consultation document on flood risk, PPG, at the end of last year, and they said they're going to update the PPG on flood risk shortly. Again, similar language. Well, shortly in that case proved to be 10 months, which is not probably what most people would think of as shortly, but everything's relative. The reality is that the current parliamentary session comes to an end in the spring, so there'll be a new King's speech around about, say, April, March next year. And so the first thing to do is watch out for what's said in that. Is there going to be a, whatever they call it, environment permit, probably will not be a snappy title, but will there be something in the King's speech as a name check? Doesn't have to be, but that would be a fairly good clue. There's obviously the current government have an awful lot on their reform agenda, so how high up this will be in the priorities, very much doubt. A huge amount. It's important legislation, but probably not many marshal seats going to be determined on environmental permitting law, one is likely to imagine. So I suspect it may be a sort of later stage of the current parliament as opposed to something in the next couple of years. And clearly it's going to require quite a lot of drafting as well by the bill team. Once the bill comes forward, how long is it likely to take? Well, the planning infrastructure bill, which I've been kind of heavily involved in, is perhaps a useful kind of guide to how long it's likely to take to go through Parliament. That was introduced in the House of Commons in March, and it seems like it will conclude its parliamentary journey sometime around 2 a.m. on Monday. It's the best guess. It's what we call ping pong, where it's been through its first, second, and third readings in both houses, and then it goes backwards and forwards between the House of Commons and House of Lords until somebody blinks first. So, roughly speaking, March till the end of November. So that's the sort of order of magnitude. That bill has been expedited but also controversial. I'd imagine that a legislation give effect to a reform permitting model probably likely to be less controversial, but probably also likely to be less expedited because they want to get the pin on the statute books before the budget in order to create an OBR figure, so the increases in taxes are a little bit less than they otherwise would be. So I would imagine, give or take 3/4 of a year is the likely journey that the legislation will go through Parliament. So again, I'm only speculating. My best guess is it will probably, in the current trajectory, so unless there's an early election, be on the statute books before the next election, but probably not very much before, and possibly not enforced by the end of the next election, is my kind of general sense of where the land lies. So pass back to Nina with that.
Thank you so much, Charlie. If I may say, that was a stream of common sense. I love that. But if there was a general pervading proportionality principle, we would not probably have seen 100 million at that time.
Correct. Or fish disco.
Yeah, there's a balance to be struck, as you say, and it would allow a lot more flexibility to strike the right balance in the public interest. I can update. I grabbed someone. What day is it today? Thursday, so Monday, about the Wild Justice claim. So Charlie mentioned the Section 2 of the Environment Act statement turning out to be quite a fun provision. We've really lobbied hard to get it. There will be no regression of environmental protection commitment in the Environment Act way back in 2021. We failed spectacularly on that. We've got this little irritating Section 20 that's turned out to be quite fun, where the minister, in a statement of environmental law, has to certify on the face of the bill that it will not have the effect of reducing the level of environmental protection provided for by any existing environmental law, as at the date of the Environment Act, as Charlie said, or otherwise. I'm not sure why she wasn't just honest about it and said it will reduce the level of environmental protection, but I think it's worth it. That would have saved Angela Rayner some pain. So what happened with that case? It was recently heard, and the judge, it was your former Chambers mate, head of the planning court now, Tim Mould, and he very cleverly refused to accept jurisdiction to determine whether he had jurisdiction. So it was sort of a ghost hearing in the courts of justice, where they heard, it was a full day hearing, and as I understand matters from a speech talking to someone in the hallway on Monday, the judge said he didn't have jurisdiction. The issue, if there is an issue, is something that Parliament has to deal with, as you would expect. So that was, given the constitutional implications of a statement made in Parliament being litigated in the courts, they had Sir James Eadie defending the government on that. So the big guns were brought out for that. Didn't go anywhere. And then finally, we have Hinckley C in the room. Right, we don't have Hinckley in the room.
Fair enough.
You do, but I've got nothing to do with small modular. I do big ones, so sorry.
Exactly. Why would you? All things nuclear are not in the same basket. Thank you. You're very welcome to be here. We don't have roving mics because we've got very sensitive microphones, and I cheekily didn't mention, so if anyone is muttering amongst yourselves about how rubbish the chairing is, it will have picked up and been broadcast on the Zoom. We don't have any questions on the online Q&A, so this is a shout out to you online people who've stayed remarkably keen to listen. Do put it in the Q&A on Zoom. And in the room, are there any questions? We're going to have a short, well, not a short Q&A, a Q&A as long as it stays interesting to me. And then we're going to move on to the creative content aspect of the section. Any questions? There's got to be some. We've had, okay. Organizers' prerogative. We're going to go to Antonia first. Yes.
I thought something that seems to pervade all three is water resources. So it seems to be the thing that actually, when we're talking initially about data centers, water resources isn't part of the permit necessarily. There was a bit of I think I saw there was a change in some of the EU legislation to consider it. Is there a BAT that means that if you are putting in a permit, if you are more considerate about your water use, you are going to get preferential treatment or better? Is there any provision for that?
Well, for data centers specifically, no, because the water use at the data center is outside the boundary of the permit. The permit is only considering the generators side of things. So no, there isn't. That said, if you look at the changes that have been made to the EU Industrial Emissions Directive, now there is a presumption that your environmental policy, and then obviously all your objectives and targets and everything that comes off that, will consider water use and reuse within it. So because that's actually in the text, the main text of the directive, and not within any back conclusions, etc., it's overarching. And so in that vein, the DEFRA consultation was looking at, well, should we have more horizontal BAT that covers everything? And we used to have a lot more horizontal BAT than we do now. But then again, that goes into the part of, well, industry needs certainty. And if something is in a BAT document, you know it's going to be like that for years. And if you're introducing horizontal BAT, suddenly it's not just that, you've got to consider all these other things. And does that introduce a lot less certainty? That's great when it's published. You know, the surface treatment of metals one is in final draft in EU now. It's 20 years old. Won't apply in the UK, which is a pity, because now they're introducing emission limits for PFAS within that, which will go into permits for sectors that you might not necessarily tie to PFAS. and they're bringing in semiconductor manufacturing into that bad conclusions document as well. We know from talking to them that the regulators here are talking to semiconductor manufacturers with a view to what is happening in the EU. So maybe we will do the same thing there. But yeah, it's difficult. And I think the horizontal bat part, I did respond to the consultation and I said the horizontal bat part has worked well in the past. Where it hasn't worked, they've revoked them. But it's the certainty part that we need more than ever with our economy at the moment.
Okay, just behind the lady in the green, we've got a very patient question. Oscar.
Hi, I'm Joe Broadway from Albion Chambers. It's a general question that does need a little bit of background, so apologies for a minute or so of background.
I'll cut you off if you go on.
Yeah, I won't go on too long. Is it too pessimistic to say that it feels like there's a bit of a regulatory car crash coming? Because I do a lot of stuff in waste sector and contaminated land. And there's been a lot of consultations like you talk about with the EPA, like what should we regulate, says the EA. And then we've got a huge backlog of environmental permitting, environmental permits coming through the EA, plus new areas potentially being brought into the permitting regime, as well as conversations about smashing all three existing regulators together and maybe even throwing in continuous monitoring, which just with potential statutory basic surcharges for certain bridges sounds like an absolute car crash waiting to happen on its own. It all just feels like, I practice in crime as well, and it all just feels so much like the we are tough on crime rhetoric that happened for decades in this country and has resulted in the state that the criminal justice system is in a minute, where nothing was funded, but lots of pressure was put on to prosecute lots of things and to make everything a crime that results in imprisonment. It feels like with regards to environmental regulation, there's a lot of we are tough on environmental regulation rhetoric in the political sphere that isn't being backed up by funding, for example, to allow the regulators to actually do that work, and a lot of changes and sort of reform being brought in at the same time. That all just feels like it's an absolute disaster waiting to happen when I listen to all three of you talk at the same time about the different areas.
My perspective on that, something I was going to say is there's not always a lot of joined up government in this space. I personally think it would be quite helpful if environmental regulation was brought within the same roof as MHCLG. I saw this when I was involved in behind the scenes for the last election in relation to nutrient neutrality and trying to bust through that. You have turf wars between DEFRA and MHCLG. And they all, MHCLG think EIA and habitat affects their ability to live. DEFRA see it as theirs. You then got conflicts within DEFRA between the farmers and the environment. You've got water there too. So I think part of what you're talking about is actually a step back from the sort of regulation car crash. It's going back to government, having joined up government, and you have different people saying different things about we're going to be proportional, we're going to get spades in the ground. And then they extend the habitat regulation supplies to Ramsars a week after CG5. Personal beef on that one. There's just mixed messages. It goes back to what I was saying in response to Mark's mixed message. You have a document saying we're going to be proportionate, and then in fact, when you look at the detail of it, they're going to actually increase regulation on some kinds of projects. So that's what I think. If you had one minister, like John Prescott had a super department that had joined up responsibility for regulation of all forms of land use. That makes sense. That's the way to describe it. That may help.
I've got a funny story about joining up government bodies. When in Wales, the NRW was created, which was a combination of the equivalent of Natural England and the Environment Agency, it tried to sue itself. MCLG and DEFRA. But there is in the Environment Audit Committee's report that was just published, it's been a long week, this week at some point, there is talk about bringing DEFRA into the planning tent with a role in approving local plans, which would be very interesting if that happened. But certainly there needs to be, as you say, a reduction in the silo thinking. Now, lady in the green sweater,
Thank
your
you.
turn.
This is a question for Joe. Speaking about moving away from static permit conditions, That's fascinating. I've got a bit of a two-parter for you, if that's okay. So first of all, what do you envisage that looking like? And second of all, we've heard that industry needs certainty, operators need certainty. How do operators plan if they don't know how the condition is going to move?
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest. I don't have the answers. I thought I'd put it out there because it would appear to be the direction of travel and could be really beneficial for the environment. But actually how you deliver that is, it's mind-boggling really to think of all those data points and all that information and actually how to turn that into something with certainty. It would be really difficult. Sewage treatment works like certainty. They like a pretty standard effluent flow coming into them. That's how they operate best. So, it might be a pipe dream, but it feels like it could have some real benefits, even if it's just a local level. Being able to unlock some of that and potentially using AI to do that would be fascinating. But just the in-river water quality monitoring, what that's going to tell us could be more confusing. Actually, it could be a really confusing picture. And I've heard sort of anecdotal conversations in the office around, well, when it rains, the river water quality improves, but you've got all these storm overflows operating. So how is that? How is that going to be taken forward? So it's mind-boggling, and I don't have the answers. I'm sorry.
It was part of the DEFRA consultation was talking about variable permits and site level permitting as well, which is I'll talk about a site. Site level permitting would say, okay, well, you're allowed to basically pollute this much. How you do that on your site is up to you. And there are certain industries, they have to be very fast moving, new piece of kit, put that in 18 months to wait for a permit, or potentially less for a variation. They're going to do it anyway. They know they're breaking the law. They've told the regulator they're doing it anyway, and it's economically beneficial to do that for them. Move a piece of equipment, submit a variation, wait 10 months plus, or just do it. And so they're just doing it.
We have seen some catchment permitting. It's not been available to all companies depending on their performance, but there is some precedent there on things like nitrogen and phosphorus around balancing the load on the environment across different assets. So there's some things happening already in that space.
Jo, you mentioned exactly what is in the back of my head. With that, it could be linked up to catchment level permitting. It seems the right way because then it aligns with RBMPs and river basin management planning and other regulatory regimes. So I've lost track of the time because that was so interesting. I think we've eaten into the creative content time, but I'm going to take one further round of questions because I think there was another hand up. That wasn't a dissuading how think we are. How can you see that, Pip? And I can't. It just says, please add Q&A in the tab. How do you?
Well, then maybe there isn't.
But there's this all red notifications.
Yeah, I know. I've been instructed strictly not to touch it. Our handy, glamorous assistant will check out if that is actually a question. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Marvelous. This is how incompetent. I swear I can use Zoom. I also swear I was banned from touching things. All right. In the World Justice cases, there a report on the case explaining how the government defended Section 20. There won't be a report of the case unless the judge done something very weird because he never accepted he had jurisdiction to hear the case. So technically the case was never actually lodged never heard by the court. Although I have had judges just ask for things to be published with completely without any basis whatsoever because there are thresholds that you're supposed to meet, permission decisions that normally aren't published, but judges just order them to be published sometimes. So I don't know whether that is the case. I don't think so, even how the case was heard. So it would be very interesting. If I were the government, I wouldn't be publishing that because they don't have to. Thank you to our incredible panel. That was such a thought-provoking set of interventions, and you can tell from the discussion in the room, everyone has been thoroughly provoked. So drinks are ready, I've been told. Thank you to the online participants and who asked the question. And I think nothing further but to thank our panels, thank all of you, and thank Antonia, Harriet, Pippi, Pippa, Louise, Tony, Maisie, many others. I could go on and on, all of the LVF folks and UKELA Southwest for this wonderful evening and all that you do. Thank you very much. I can't turn this on.
Great, lovely.